Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Is India's case on the eastern and western borders with China convincing and irrefutable? And how effectively did Nehru handle the situation? A book published during the dark days of the pandemic, which unfortunately has not got the attention it deserves, raises deep, disturbing questions. The book clearly states that India's case on the two borders with China is not convincing, it's not irrefutable, and it also clearly suggests that Nehru's handling was irresponsible, not just because he ignored the infirmities, but also because he hid them from the Indian people. Here is the book. It's called Nehru, Tibet and China, and its author was in fact head of the historical division of the Ministry of External Affairs for 30 years, and therefore he's clearly someone who knows what he's saying. In fact, he's had access to invaluable documents not seen by many people. His name is Avtar Singh Bhasin, and today Mr. Bhasin is my guest. Mr. Bhasin, as I said in that introduction, your book pretty convincingly shows that India's case on the western and eastern borders with China is neither convincing nor irrefutable, and Nehru's handling was irresponsible, not just because he didn't pay attention to the infirmities, but worse, he hid them from the Indian people. Now, I'll come to Nehru a little later. Let's first start with the borders, and let's in fact start with the western border. Your book clearly shows that Survey of India maps from independence till 1954 showed the western border as undefined. Doesn't that mean that for the first 7 years of independence, we did not know where the boundary lay on the western side?
Yes, you are right, sir. That is what the documents which I have accessed from the Teen Murti, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and which are Nehru's own official papers, show this. And unfortunately, one cannot ignore the facts which come out of these papers that it was badly handled. The western sector is really the hub of the whole thing, and this is where we have gone wrong.
So just so the audience is clear, the western sector boundary for the first 7 years after independence was undefined. It was shown on Indian maps as undefined,
yes, sir.
Which means we did not know where the boundary lay.
You are right. You are right.
Now, the British in the 19th century did two surveys of Aksai Chin. The first produced what's called the Johnson-Ardak line, which included the whole of Aksai Chin in India. The second produced what's called the Macartney-MacDonald line, which virtually gave the whole of Aksai Chin to China. China accepted neither of these lines. But when in 1954 Nehru ordered that Indian maps must now show the boundary as defined, India chose the Johnson-Ardak line. Doesn't this mean that Nehru decided unilaterally to define the border without any sense that China would accept?
Yes, it happens. You see, Nehru knew, everybody knew it's an undefined border. In 1954, after the Tibet agreement had been signed, it came to Nehru's notice. Notice it had already come, but here he particularly noticed when he read the report of Mr. Gopalachari, who was one of the officers involved in the negotiation in 1954, and he had taken this report with him to Mushobra in Shimla Hills when he went on holiday and read it. And it was in July 1954, after reading it, he ordered on that file that our border, which is undefined, all these maps should be withdrawn, and the new maps should be prepared with a defined line. And that line will be our border, and it should not be discussed, and it is not open to discussion, and we must stand by that.
And the defined line he chose was the Johnson-Ardak line, and he chose it unilaterally without any sense that China would agree. A border is something that's agreed by two countries. Nehru defined it unilaterally.
Sir, that is why the British did not define it, because there was no agreement with China any of the lines. And these surveys were conducted by British unilaterally. China was not involved in these. China was dilly-dallying in accepting them. And therefore, when 1954 Nehru decided to draw the line, it was required as an international border to define the line with the Chinese consent, with consultation with the Chinese, which he did not do.
In fact, there's something very important at this point to point out. I want to now quote what two foreign secretaries said about the western border. First, R.K. Nehru, who was in fact a relative of Jawaharlal Nehru, said, and I am quoting, "Our experts had advised us that our claim to Aksai Chin was not too strong." Second, Subimul Dutt, who as late as 1959 pointed out that the western boundary was not properly delimited, which means even though after 1954 Indian maps were showing the border as defined, our foreign secretaries were saying it's not defined, it's not properly delimited.
Well, again, you are right, as I said. See, I will like to quote here the third statement, which is Nehru's own statement, made in the Rajya Sabha on 9 December 1959. What did he say? He said, "I had doubt, my ministry had doubt about our stand. What will happen in the future?" After, he says, discussing with various people, we decided to stay with this narrative, and under the understanding that in course of time, events will settle it, and when the problem arises, we will be strong.
This is very interesting. Nehru himself admitted in Parliament in 1959 that we had doubts, we weren't sure, but we decided nonetheless to stick with our own unilateral interpretation.
Exactly.
In the hope that over time it will be accepted. He was gambling. This is a gamble.
That is unfortunately the situation.
In fact, there's something else that you bring out in your book about Nehru. Maybe not in 1959, but another date. Nehru also said that the western boundary was, and I'm quoting him, defined chiefly by long usage and custom. This was his way around the fact that it wasn't actually a defined and delimited border. But as your book points out, there is no proof of this long usage, there is no proof of this custom.
So, usage and custom was good in good old days when there were no instruments for surveying the border. But in 1959, in second part of the 20th century, it was no longer good. Even if, first of all, there was not much traffic in this area, even if there was usage, question is, no border today can stand scrutiny if it is only by usage and custom. Nehru himself several times in Parliament said repeatedly that the border is not demarcated, but well known by custom and usage.
Absolutely, but custom and usage is a concept that applies to centuries earlier, not 1959. Now, in fact, India's position on the western border was further weakened by the fact that although our maps after 1954 had started to show it as defined and clearly delimited, we were not in control of the area. And this is what you write in your book. India, even after having altered the border in 1954, had taken no steps to establish its military, political or administrative presence in the area. No checkpost had been set up, no flag was unfurled to announce its sovereignty. India thought that merely drawing a line on the map was enough to announce its ownership. Isn't it bizarre to claim that you own a territory but make no effort to control it? Worse, no effort to even set up checkposts.
Not only that, in 1959 again, a note was sent to China in which it was said that we did not establish checkpost here because we thought there is no population in the area, it is very sparsely populated, and there was no reason for us to anticipate that China will occupy it.
At this point, it's worth bringing up something else. I know I'm bringing it up out of the historical chronology I'm following, but in fact, during the days of the Kuomintang government, pre-1949, before the communists took over in China, India's ambassador of the day in China admitted to the Chinese that in fact the western boundary was undefined, that it would need to be defined once there was order in China, because at the time China was going through a disorderly period. Isn't that right? India had told the Chinese, we know the border is undefined. So Nehru's position of 1959 contradicts what his ambassador had said just before 1949.
Yeah, you are right. That is this whole thing is full of contradictions. Whole thing is full of contradictions.
Who was the ambassador who communicated to the Chinese that we accept the border is not defined, and it will only be defined when there is a settled situation.
Mr. K.P.S. Menon was the ambassador there, who later on became foreign secretary.
And he did this because the Kuomintang had got in touch wanting to define the border. And what was his reply?
Well, you see, the Chinese at that stage just accepted it. Okay, when naturally the whole of China was in ferment, the revolution was at its peak, and within a few weeks, in fact, Kuomintang was thrown away. So naturally, they accepted that they were more concerned about the stability than about the borders.
But the important thing is KPS Menon, as ambassador in China, and remember later on he went on to become foreign secretary, officially told the Chinese, we accept the border is undemarcated, we know it needs to be defined, but we'll do it when there is a more settled situation in China.
But he said this instructions from Delhi.
Absolutely.
He's not on his own.
And therefore what Nehru maintained in Parliament is a contradiction of what he had told his ambassador to say in 1949.
As I said, the whole book, Indian case, is full of contradictions. This is the problem.
In fact, if I can use a colloquial phrase, India's position on the western border was perhaps destroyed by the fact that China built a 120-kilometer long road in Aksai Chin. And during the 7 years, not 1 or 2, but during the 7 years it took to build that road, India was utterly unaware the road was being built. Secondly, when India did find out in 1957, it only lodged an informal protest. Thirdly, that informal protest lost much of its significance because in the protest, India also complained about the fact that the Chinese who built the road had not asked for an Indian visa. And worst of all, this becomes almost ludicrous now. In the same protest, India asked for Chinese help to locate Indians who had gone missing on patrol duty. All of this would be laughable if it weren't true.
See, again I have to come and say the same thing, that there are so many contradictions in our situation, in our border, in our stand, that it is difficult to justify one or the other. When later on our Chai affair in Beijing told Chou En-lai that you have built road in our territory, Chou En-lai shot back. It took us 7 years to construct this road. Where were you if it was your territory?
You're absolutely sure of these facts, that part of that A, the protest was informal, that B, in the protest, we asked for Chinese help to locate Indians who'd gone missing on patrol duty. You're absolutely sure of these facts?
Absolutely, documented. And anybody can see this document.
These are part of the official records of the Ministry of External Affairs.
Exactly.
Which you had access to as head of the historical department.
Exactly. No. From the Nehru papers in the Teen Murti.
So these are part of the Nehru papers.
Exactly. And these are highly classified papers.
Now there's a corollary to the request India made in the informal protest for help from the Chinese to locate these Indians who'd gone missing. China replied by saying, we've located them and we will deport them. And it's what India said in response to that actually gives the game away. This is what India said, I'm quoting, the question whether this particular area is in Indian or Chinese territory is a matter in dispute which is to be dealt with separately. That is India clearly saying itself, we aren't sure of our claim on Aksai Chin.
I don't know what I should say in reply, because this is exactly the fact. This is exactly the fact.
So just to sum up, we're talking at the moment only about the western border, but India has not got, and I'm using a colloquial phrase, a leg to stand on. Our claim that Aksai Chin is ours is based on literally nothing.
Well, Nehru admitted many times in 1959 also, earlier also in a note I said that this area we had no access. We had not been able to have any checkpost there and we have no access. And why we had no access, why we have not done it? Because we thought nobody will occupy it.
So no one will occupy it, therefore we will claim it's ours even though we can't prove it's ours. Is that right?
That's right.
Let's then at this point, Mr. Bhasin, come to the other border. Now I'm talking about the eastern border. Here India's claim is based upon the validity of the 1914 McMahon line. But we all know that China wasn't party to the Simla Convention where the McMahon Line was agreed, and China never agreed the McMahon Line. And this is true not just of the communist government, but it's also true of the Kuomintang government, who were their predecessors. And Nehru knew this. It wasn't something Nehru didn't know. Nehru knew it from the very day he became Prime Minister.
Well, you see, he said, McMahon Line is our border, map or no map, and we will not allow anybody to cross it. That was his first stand in November 1951 in Parliament. Now, he should have known, and everybody in the ministry should have known, that this had been. Nehru later on also said that no government since 1914 accepted this line, and I do not think China will accept it. He being aware of this, yet he said, this is our border and we will not let anybody come in.
In other words, what he was saying was contradicted by the facts.
Well, he was deciding on behalf of himself and on behalf of others also.
In fact, and your book points this out, Henry McMahon, who drew the 1914 McMahon Line, himself seriously questioned the line in 1935. This is what Henry McMahon said in 1935. He called it a verbal definition of the boundaries between Tibet and China. And you go further and say this means the McMahon Line was drawn on a map without surveys and was not delineated. It needed to be surveyed, delineated and demarcated. In other words, the McMahon Line was pretty effectively meaningless.
Well, you see, we have to also understand that no survey was conducted when this line was drawn, number one. He drew this line with a pen with a thick nib. When you use a thick nib, 2-3 kilometers in a small map doesn't mean anything. It could be here and could be there. Secondly, McMahon was not a cartographer or a surveyor when he drew the line. It was the job of some cartographer who should have drawn the line in a very precise manner. But McMahon took upon himself, because at that time nobody was there to challenge him.
Now, there are 4 facts at this point which your book brings out, which we need to point out to the audience. First, the British never occupied the territory between the northeastern border of that time and the McMahon Line. Second, Tibet remained in occupation of Tawang, even though according to the McMahon Line and the Simla Convention, Tawang was part of India. Third, Tibet wanted the McMahon Line adjusted to return what they called indisputable Tibetan territories that had been included into India. And fourth, and maybe the fourth is the most important of the lot, the British government had indicated a willingness to do this. So clearly, in the eyes of the British, the McMahon Line was not sacrosanct, and the British did not believe that the eastern border had been settled for all time. They were willing to make adjustments to suit the Tibetans.
You are right. In 1944, Basil Gold, who was the political officer in Gangtok, he went to Tibet, Lhasa, and with the permission and concurrence of the Foreign Office in London and India Office in London, it was conveyed to the Tibetans in Lhasa that Government of India would adjust the border to run south of Tawang, which means this area will go back to Tibet. And secondly, during all this period, the Tibetans were not only in control, but they were collecting the civil revenue also and keeping it themselves, not giving it to the British. They were collecting the civil revenue, and that is the sign of sovereignty, and keeping it with themselves.
So the position Nehru took on the McMahon Line and the eastern border was in contradiction to the position the British had taken. Nehru keeps claiming that in fact India will stand by the borders left by the British, but the British themselves had taken a different position and were willing to negotiate and hand back Tawang to the Tibetans.
But you see, in 1948, July 1948, Indian note to Tibet, to Lhasa, itself had said that we will adjust this border in the Tawang area. Not only the British said it, but we also said it in July 1948.
Which means Nehru's government said it.
Exactly.
So when Nehru
will adjust and not only that, 3 months later, our political officer in Gangtok, who was the supervisory officer for Tibet, wrote to Ministry of External Affairs, having settled it, please go ahead and do it.
So Nehru's position on the eastern border is full of contradictions. It's riddled with contradiction. Let me point out something else, because this is another very important fact. Tawang remained in Tibetan hands, even though technically under the McMahon line it was supposed to be Indian, but it remained in Tibetan hands right up till 1951. You point out in your book that India only occupied Tawang after Tibet began to fall increasingly under Chinese control, and it did so because if Tawang remained Tibetan, then it would become Chinese, and as you point out, that would mean that China's border would come down to the plains of Assam. But the important point is, for the first 4 years after independence, Tawang was not in Indian control, it was in Tibetan control. And as you point out, in 1948, Nehru's government had indicated to the Tibetans it would be quite happy to convert de facto into de jure.
Well, it is so. I don't know what to say about these facts. They are there, undocumented fully in our own classified papers.
No one can deny these facts.
Anybody can consult these papers, not only my 5-volume study, but go to Teen Murthy and ask for these papers to be shown, and he can see them.
So just as I asked you this question when we were talking about the western border, I'll ask you the same question now that we're talking about the eastern border. You're absolutely sure of these facts. They're indisputable.
I'm as sure as death is sure to come to me or to anybody else. Because these are fully documented, and I can produce these documents to anybody who wants to see them. And they can personally go and see them in the Teen Murthy library.
Now, against this background, let's come to Nehru's position on the McMahon line. You mentioned it a little earlier, but I want to mention it again because I think repetition is important at this point. Nehru said to Parliament in November 1951, and I'm quoting him, "Our maps show that the McMahon line is our boundary and that it is our boundary, map or no map. The fact remains we stand by that boundary and we will not allow anybody to come across that boundary." This means, once again, just as he had done in the West, Nehru was in the East unilaterally declaring the boundary, and this time he was doing it in defiance, A, of the infirmity of the McMahon line, B, in defiance of China's known position, and C, in defiance of the history that you and I have just discussed.
Yeah, in the case of Eastern Border, there was a line which was drawn by McMahon. Whatever faulty it was is a different thing. In the case of Western sector, there
Even
was no
that
line.
didn't exist.
So there was a line to talk about. And he said, this is our border, McMahon line is our border, map or no map.
But he was ignoring in the process, A, the infirmities of the line, B, the Chinese position because they didn't accept it, and C, the history that even the British were willing to make adjustments, and indeed his own government in 48 had said they were willing to make adjustments. He was ignoring all of that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let's at this point, Mr. Bhasin, talk about 3 specific issues to do with how Nehru handled the boundary. First, the boundary could have, some people say it should have been discussed and raised when India was negotiating with China what became the Tibet Agreement of 1954. Under that agreement, India gave up its privileges in Tibet. If the boundary had been negotiated at the same time, it could have been a quid pro quo. But Nehru didn't do it. Was that in your eyes a mistake by Nehru?
Sir, here also the same position. We had ourselves, as in 2 August 1952, given a note to the government of China that in discussing our position in Tibet, there are 7 issues to be discussed, to be settled. And those 7 issues did not include the border. When Nehru wrote to Chou En-lai on 1st September 1953, asking for negotiations on Tibet, he said, the issues to be settled are as conveyed in our note of 2nd August 1952. And similar note was given to the Chinese ambassador in Delhi, And in that also this line was added that the issues to be settled are the 7 issues mentioned in Government of India's note of 2nd August 1952.
And the border was not one of those 7 issues.
Border was not one of them.
Was it a mistake to leave the border out?
Well, mistake was our own doubts about the border. We did not want to discuss the border. Nehru had told Panikkar when he went to Beijing to take up his assignment that don't discuss the border. We are sure about our borders, and why should we discuss it? Our initiative to discuss the border will mean that we have doubt about our border. We have no doubt.
In other words, don't discuss it, because if we discuss it, a can of worms will open up. So to prevent that can of worms opening up, let's not discuss it at all, let's not raise it, and hope that with time it will be accepted.
Well, let me add here, when Vajpayee, who was Secretary General Ministry earlier and now was Governor of Bombay, wrote to Panikkar that why have you excluded this border question? And his reply was very interesting. He said, I have excluded it because Chinese are unlikely to accept it. And if they don't accept it, our position becomes enormous. And secondly,
that gives the game away, by the way. I've excluded it because the Chinese won't accept it. Therefore, rather than open a can of worms, let's not talk about it at all.
And secondly, even if they don't accept it and they ask for negotiations, we don't want to enter into negotiations.
Let me at this point very quickly explain. The Panikkar referred to was K.M. Panikkar, who at the time was India's ambassador in Peking, as it was called. And the Vajpayee you referred to was Sir Girija Shankar Vajpayee, who was the first Secretary General of the MEA. But at that moment of time, he was governor in Bombay. And Vajpayee had said to Panikkar, it's a mistake not to raise the border. And Panikkar had replied that Nehru told me when I took charge as ambassador in China not to raise the border. And in fact, India's hope, and I'm quoting from your book, India's hope was that if we don't raise the border and China is silent and doesn't raise it itself, this is the critical thing. If China doesn't raise the border itself, it means acquiescence, if not acceptance of our position. And that was another mistake, because China's silence was not acquiescence and acceptance. China's silence, it turns out, was simply that China was waiting for the right time.
China's strategy was very simple. They first of all wanted to throw India out of Tibet, end the privileges and end its position in Tibet. Then take up the border issue separately. And since Nehru had said that our borders are not negotiable, China was little hesitant in taking up the issue with Nehru. Chinese, what happened after 1954 agreement was signed, started nibbling on the border, so that India asked for negotiations.
But the interesting thing is that Nehru misread China's silence. Nehru misread the Chinese. He thought that if China doesn't raise the border itself, it means China has accepted India's stand and claim. But in fact, China's silence was not acceptance. China was waiting for the right time. And in a sense, Nehru ended up falling into what looks like a Chinese trap.
Sir, I don't know how I can define Nehru. He was somebody who was absolutely guiding the policy without properly, I would say, understanding it.
Guiding without understanding.
I would say that way. Please allow me to, I'm sorry I'm making this statement, but I think I can't help making this statement. In 1954, as I said, borders were not to be discussed, okay? And they were not discussed. But when the negotiations were going on in Tibet, in Beijing, Government of India and Delhi sent a telegram to the ambassador, please include 3 passes in the western sector in this agreement. The ambassador replied back immediately, the 3 passes are in the Xi Chin area, and asking China to include these passes would inevitably lead to discussion of the border. Please wire instructions. And the instruction given was, forget these 3 passes, don't ask for their inclusion, that is all.
In other words, we weren't even sure of what we were doing.
Exactly.
The third point I want to raise about Nehru's handling of the border is this. Your book makes it clear that Nehru hid all the problems, all the doubts from the Indian public. This is what you write. Nehru found it embarrassing to share differences on the border with the public. He remained reluctant to admit in public that there were any major differences with China on the frontiers. In other words, he knew there were problems. He denied it to himself because he carried on behaving as if there was no problem, but he knew there was. And secondly, he denied it to the Indian public. And when I say denied it to the Indian public, he denied it to the Indian Parliament.
Well, that is so. He himself made a statement in Parliament in 1959, when the whole thing burst open, that I am sorry I kept all these people away from, all these details away from the people, in the hope that something will happen and the matter will get settled and there will be no excitement in the public.
But
He was banking on something happening and settling everything, and everything would be
quite right.
hunky-dory.
He was hoping for some sort of magic to work in India's favor.
Well, that is what you were right in saying that.
Let's now at this point, Mr. Bhasin, briefly come to China's position. First, regarding the McMahon line. Both Zhou Enlai and Chinese Foreign Minister Chen Yi, I should tell the audience that Zhou Enlai was the Prime Minister of China at the time, both of them had repeatedly said that they wanted the McMahon line renegotiated because it was an unequal treaty imposed by imperialists at a time when China was weak. But, and you point this out in your book, and perhaps this is very important, China repeated several times that in a renegotiated agreement in the eastern sector, China would accept the present border and claim no territory to the south of the McMahon line. China would concede the McMahon line border, and India would not stand to lose any territory south of the line. In other words, what China was saying was, humor us, renegotiate, but we are giving you a guarantee it will stay the way it is, you lose no territory. But because we believe this is an unequal treaty imposed when we were weak by imperialists and we've never recognized it, we want party to the Simla Convention, humor us, renegotiate, and you'll have the outcome you want.
Well, this he said when Swaran, you see, there was separate talk between Swaran Singh and Chen Yi, and there are two rounds, and also they traveled together to Agra and carried on the negotiation. Swaran Singh said to Chen Yi, when you say this, what he has said, okay, we will not claim any territory south of the McMahon line, and he said, then what is the use of having a new agreement when you are going to stand by this? And the Chinese reply was, Chen Yi's reply was, look, this is the treaty, humiliating treaty for us, and we cannot live with this. It was simple. He said, please have faith in us. We are not going to claim an inch of territory south of McMahon line. It will be the same. You will not lose anything. But we cannot live with this because it is humiliating for us too.
It seems from what you're saying that India's position refusing to renegotiate was zid, obstinacy, zid. Secondly, and this is the other important point about China's position on the border that I want to bring up. In 1960, China suggested a swap. China said it would accept India's full claim on the eastern border in line with the McMahon line. In return, they wanted India to accept Chinese control over Aksai Chin. Now, as you point out in your book, on the Aksai Chin side, the border was undefined, and the whole of Aksai Chin was not in Indian control. So what the Chinese were suggesting was a very reasonable resolution. Nehru ignored it. Was this a mistake by Nehru to ignore it?
Well, that is what this position is. I don't know what I should, how I should answer this question, because what you have said is also my answer.
In other words, here was an opportunity to settle the matter, to control what we wanted in the East, and to give up nominal ownership of on the West, because actually we didn't control it. So we weren't losing territory, we never had it in the first place. This was an ideal solution, and Nehru ignored it.
Undoubtedly, it was an ideal solution. But you see, some people have pointed out, and also because after the Konka Pass incident in 1959 October, where several of the Indian policemen were killed, there was furor in the country, and the things were made out that China has betrayed us. We have been so friendly, so brotherly, that they have stabbed us in the back. So there was a sort of understanding within the country that China indeed had been perfidious, and therefore no concession should be made to China, and his back was to the wall.
Absolutely. Public opinion wouldn't have allowed Nehru to make concessions, but the
Exactly.
problem is that public opinion had become uninformed. Nehru had not informed the public. Nehru had actually hidden from the public the truth. So, in fact, if Nehru had been honest and shared with the public, and by public I mean Parliament, that there are problems, that we have an uncertain position, that the Chinese have a quietly good stand, then public opinion would have been different. So, Nehru had boxed himself into a corner.
That was the problem. No? Public opinion had gone, even Parliament, even the cabinet was not aware. And cabinet also strongly supported that we should maintain our stand and not make concession to the.
So now Nehru was paying a price for not telling people the truth. His room for maneuver had ended.
That is unfortunately the situation.
We're coming right to the end of this interview, but I want to touch on two conclusions which are there in your book, and I'll take them up one by one. First is what I think is your conclusion about Nehru. It's your conclusion about Nehru. You write, the Prime Minister had taken a simplistic view of the border, and then you add, Nehru's insistence that India's borders were what they were, map or no maps, was unsustainable and proved disastrous for him and the nation, who felt humiliated and demoralized. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is Nehru mishandled the border situation with China.
Exactly.
Badly mishandled it.
Sir?
Badly mishandled it.
Yeah. See, he continued to stand by the same situation which they were at there, which he had taken in 1951 November. And he did not budge from it despite so much facts came known in between, despite so much development had taken place in between, he remained stuck to his 1951 position.
Now the second conclusion, in some senses, looks forward. You write, today we have become prisoners of the past. This means a solution of the border problem requires convincing the Indian public that the position taken by India in the past was not a rational one. And secondly, the second is perhaps the most important, convincing the Indian public that China was not altogether perfidious as it was made out to be. My question is this, is it going to be very difficult to convince the Indian public that Nehru was wrong and China was not perfidious? Or do you think that Mr. Modi, who has refuted and repudiated so much of Nehru's legacy, could go this one step further?
No, on his own, if he does it, there will be problem with the country. Given the fractious nature of our politics, people will only accuse him of selling the country which Nehru had saved for India. What is more important is that people should be educated that our position in the 50s and 60s, earlier 60s was not correct. And this 1962 war was invited by us. We could have avoided it. There was no need for it. If in 1954 Nehru, while ordering the map to be defined, he had consulted China, there would never have been any problem whatsoever. That mistake was carried over until 1962. Chou En-lai repeatedly requested Nehru that as modern countries, two of us need to settle our border, mark our borders scientifically by surveys and discussion. And not that he said, until 1960, he never said that this is our position and nothing else. He said, let us discuss it. Let us have it surveys, so that we have our borders in terms of latitude and longitude and scientific border where there is no mistake.
The problem was Nehru kept saying no.
Exactly.
So what you're saying is, if Mr. Modi now takes a different position, he'll be accused of selling the country. People will say Nehru defended it, you sold it.
Exactly.
What has to happen is people need to be educated. They need to read this book and find out the truth. In fact, this book should be translated into every Indian language so people can know the truth and no longer be held prisoners by the past. That's what you're really saying, aren't you?
Well, that is my wish and that is my conclusion, and I will think I have redeemed my life in this country if this could happen, that we could change the situation. I will add, if you permit me, one thing more. In 1962, when the war ended, Chomlai requested Nehru, send your officers and meet our officers, and we have a demilitarized zone so that there's no trouble later, and have checkposts at fixed points, agreed fixed points. Nehru did not agree. If at that time this had been done, then the present problem which we are facing today of LAC, line of actual control, would not have been there. Today there is no line of actual control. We are fighting on perception.
What you're saying is in multiple ways we are paying the price of Nehru's obstinacy.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. My last question, Mr. Bhasin, and I'm deliberately asking it again. You have presented a set of facts based upon which you've come to conclusions which suggest that India's stand on both the eastern and western border with China is mistaken, it's not convincing, it's not refutable. Everything hinges on the validity of those facts. Do you stand by the facts in this book?
Every single fact in this book I stand by. Every single fact. If I fail to stand by any of them, I can be punished in any way this nation decides.
Mr. Bhasin, thank you very much for this interview. I think it's one of the most important interviews I have done. I hope it is widely viewed and watched. I hope the government, and by the government I mean in particular the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, hear it, read your book, and heed the lesson that India's stand was not rational and the Chinese were not altogether perfidious. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Mr. Thapar, for having me for this interview. And I apologize if I have said anything. My habit is to speak the truth, and to speak it strongly. And I speak or spoken strongly. And I said I stand by every word of what I have written. I knew what I was doing. I knew I am challenging the position of a Prime Minister who is idolized in this country. And therefore, I was very, very meticulously checking the facts again and again.
Thank you, Mr. Bhasin.